The freezing mountain mud claimed everything that fell into it. And on that bitter November evening, it was determined to swallow Evelyn whole. She stumbled against the howling wind, her breath tearing through her chest. Every step required a monumental effort. Her pastel dress, adorned with faded floral patterns, was soaked through, clinging to her slender frame and heavily caked with the dark sludge of the trail. The thin shawl draped across her delicate shoulders offered absolutely no protection against the punishing rain. She had nothing left to her name. Nothing but the heavy, waterlogged boots on her feet and the leather-bound object she pressed desperately against her violently shivering chest. She saw the warm, flickering yellow light of a lantern hanging on a rough-hewn wooden porch just ahead, but her body simply could no longer obey her desperate will to survive. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the freezing muck. What the valley townsfolk believed about the giant, reclusive man who owned that isolated boarding house was only a fraction of the truth, and the reality of what drove this fragile widow up the mountain was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Stay with me until the end of their journey, and please like and comment below to let me know where you are watching from to see how far this story travels. Silas pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out onto the porch, his massive frame blocking the light from the hearth behind him. He was a mountain of a man, possessing a physique that looked carved directly from the unforgiving granite of the peaks surrounding his land. His shoulders stretched tight against the worn, coarse fabric of his shirt, and heavy leather suspenders strained over his massive, bulging chest. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his sharp, hardened eyes scanned the tree line from beneath the wide brim of a weathered hat. He was a veteran of a terrible war, a man who had seen too much destruction and had retreated to this high, lonely pass to forget the world. He expected nothing but silence from the coming night. Then, he heard the faint, pitiful sound of ragged breathing over the roar of the storm. His heavy boots slammed against the wooden planks as he rushed down the steps. The rain lashed against his face, but he did not feel the cold. He knelt in the deep mud beside the unmoving figure. From a distance, she had looked like a discarded pile of rags. Up close, Silas realized with a jolt that it was a woman. She was incredibly petite, fragile, and utterly broken by the elements. Silas slid his massive, calloused hands beneath her shoulders and her knees. When he lifted her, she weighed scarcely more than a damp sparrow. Even in her unconscious state, her slender arms remained locked in a rigid, desperate grip around a small leather-bound book held tight against her ribs. Silas carried her out of the storm and crossed the threshold into the deep, quiet warmth of his solitary world. The interior of the boarding house smelled of aged pine, wood smoke, and profound loneliness. He moved with a surprising gentleness for a man of his immense size, carrying her directly toward the large stone hearth that dominated the common room. The fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows across his angular, serious features. He laid her carefully down upon a thick braided rug near the hearth, peeling the soaking, ruined shawl away from her delicate neck. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the firelight, her fragile features drawn tight with lingering sorrow and exhaustion. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from the back of a rocking chair and draped it securely over her shivering form. He did not know her name. He did not know who or what she was running from. He only knew that the brutal frontier did not spare the weak, and she was the most fragile creature he had ever seen. Silas knelt beside her, feeding more thick logs into the flames, allowing the deep, penetrating heat to push the deadly mountain chill out of the room. He watched her breathing, steady, a silent protector, keeping the darkness at bay. Slowly, the violent shivering began to subside. A soft groan escaped her lips. Evelyn fluttered her eyes open, her vision swimming in the golden light of the fire. Panic surged through her veins instantly. She gasped, scrambling backward against the rough stone of the hearth, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. Her wild, terrified eyes darted around the room until they locked onto the massive, intimidating figure kneeling just a few feet away. Silas did not move toward her. He remained perfectly still, his massive hands resting on his thighs, ensuring he posed no threat. He let her study the room, let her realize she was out of the rain, out of the mud, and safe. He extended a tin cup filled with warm water toward her. Evelyn stared at the cup, then up at his weathered, scarred face. Her breath hitched. She expected cruelty. She had known nothing but cruelty for months. But in the quiet depths of his dark eyes, she saw an unexpected, honorable restraint. She reached out with a trembling, mud-stained hand and took the cup, her fingers brushing against his thick, rough skin. A profound, cautious gratitude began to bloom in the center of her chest, replacing the icy grip of terror. She took a small sip, the warmth spreading down her throat. Silas gestured toward her chest with a slow, deliberate nod. His deep, rumbling voice filled the quiet room. "You must let me dry that, or the damp will ruin it." He reached out, offering to take the soaking, leather-bound book she still clutched desperately to her heart. Evelyn gasped, her fragile fingers instantly tightening into white-knuckled fists around the battered cover. She recoiled, pulling the journal away from his massive hands as if he had threatened to take her very life. Her eyes widened with fierce, undeniable protection, a sudden burst of iron will radiating from her delicate frame. Silas pulled his hand back, his brow furrowing in deep curiosity. The cover of the book was stained, the pages swollen with rain. Yet she guarded it with the ferocity of a mother protecting a child. What was written upon those water-stained pages that she valued far more than her own survival? Morning arrived with the pale, gray light of a reluctant dawn filtering through the frosted window panes. Evelyn stirred beneath the heavy wool blanket. The deep chill of the storm had vanished, replaced by the comforting warmth radiating from the stone hearth. Her fingers immediately sought the leather-bound journal. It was damp but intact, resting safely against her ribs. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the punishing journey up the mountain. She knew the brutal rules of this unforgiving frontier. A woman alone, possessing neither coin nor kin, could not survive on charity. She had to prove she held value, or she would surely be cast back out into the freezing mud. She folded the blanket with meticulous care, smoothing the thick wool with her fragile hands. Her pastel dress was dry now, though stiff with dirt at the hem. She wrapped the thin shawl tightly around her delicate shoulders and stepped softly across the wooden floorboards. The boarding house was silent, save for the rhythmic grang, heavy thud of an axe outside. She peered through the window. Silas stood in the biting morning air, his massive shoulders rolling as he split heavy oak logs with a terrifying, effortless power. His face remained a mask of stoic duty. He was a silent protector, but Evelyn knew she could not rely on his mercy forever. Evelyn turned away from the window and located the kitchen. It was a utilitarian space, built for function rather than warmth. The pantry held only the most basic survival rations, a sack of coarse flour, a few withered root vegetables, dried salt pork, and wild mountain onions. To an untrained eye, it was a meager, depressing harvest. To Evelyn, it was a canvas for salvation. She placed her precious leather journal onto the heavy wooden table and opened it with the utmost reverence. The pages were crinkled from the dampness, filled with the faded ink of the grandmother she had loved so dearly. These were the forgotten wartime recipes, the humble instructions that had kept desperate families alive when the world had turned to ash and ruin. Her delicate finger traced the elegant script until she found what she needed. The bitter broth. It was a restorative soup designed for weary soldiers marching through frozen mud, demanding nothing more than water, tough scraps of meat, wild onions, and a specific blend of charred root, ends, and toasted peppercorns to draw out the deep, rich marrow of life. Evelyn tied an old flour sack around her waist as a makeshift apron and set to work. Her movements were fluid and practiced, a quiet dance of resilience. The act of homemaking was not merely a chore for her, it was a desperate armor against a cruel world. She stoked the iron stove, feeling the comforting blast of heat against her pale cheeks. She chopped the withered root vegetables with a heavy knife, her petite frame leaning to the work. She charred the vegetable ends directly on the hot metal to unlock their hidden depth, just as the faded ink instructed. She dropped the tough salt pork into the boiling water, along with the toasted peppercorns and the wild onions. Slowly, a rich, complex aroma began to rise from the bubbling iron pot. It was an earthy, deeply savory scent that possessed a strange, haunting familiarity. It smelled exactly like survival. The heavy oak door groaned open. Silas stepped into the boarding house, bringing the cold mountain wind with him. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his massive chest heaving slowly from the morning labor. He stopped dead in his tracks. His sharp, dark eyes widened slightly as the thick aroma of the broth hit his senses. The boarding house had not smelled of actual, living care in many long, desolate years. He looked toward the kitchen and saw Evelyn standing beside the stove, her fragile face glowing in the warm light. She looked entirely out of place in his rough world, yet she had commanded the space with a quiet, undeniable dignity. Evelyn carefully poured the steaming, dark broth into a heavy wooden bowl. She picked it up with both hands, the heat radiating through the thick wood, and walked slowly toward the giant mountain man. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She offered the bowl forward, her eyes cast down in a gesture of humble gratitude. I have prepared this for you, as thanks for my life. Silas stared down at the bowl. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands dwarfing the wooden vessel. He brought the bowl toward his face, his dark eyes fixed on the dark, swirling liquid. The aroma was incredibly strong, carrying the sharp tang of charred roots and the heavy, salted weight of preserved pork. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The physical reaction of the massive man was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. Silas froze entirely. The muscles in his massive forearms corded with sudden, violent tension. The color drained completely from his weathered face, leaving a pale, haunted mask behind his thick, dark beard. The rich flavor of the broth did not bring him warmth. It acted as a brutal, invisible strike directly to his soul. It was the exact taste of the miserable winter encampments, the flavor of the final meal shared before the devastating artillery fire tore his previous world apart. The sensory memory was a vicious iron hook, dragging him backward into a nightmare he had spent countless years trying to bury beneath the heavy mountain snow. His massive chest heaved violently. He slammed the wooden bowl down onto the heavy timber table with a deafening crack. Hot broth sloshed over the rim, staining the pale wood. Evelyn gasped loudly, shrinking back, her fragile frame trembling at the sudden explosion of movement. Silas did not look at her. His dark eyes were wide, unseeing, locked onto terrible ghosts only he could witness. His hands clenched into giant fists at his sides, his knuckles turning pure white. The quiet, stoic protector had vanished, replaced by a man radiating a sudden, overwhelming fury. He turned and stormed out the heavy oak door, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the frosted window panes, leaving Evelyn alone in the terrified silence. Why did the simple, healing taste of the recipe of her grandmother make the giant man so fiercely angry? The heavy oak door remained shut against the howling morning wind. Evelyn stood completely frozen in the center of the kitchen, her delicate hands trembling above the spilled broth. The violent crash of the wooden bowl still echoed in her ears. She stared at the dark liquid staining the pale timber of the table. A lesser woman would have gathered her damp shawl and fled back into the freezing mud. She had every reason to run. The giant man was terrifying, a looming shadow of unpredictable wrath. Yet, as she looked at the spilled soup, she did not see a monster. She saw the profound, unmistakable agony of a deeply wounded soul. She knew that kind of pain. She lived with it every single day. She reached for a clean rag and began to wipe the table. She would not run. She had nowhere else to go. Hours passed. The gray light of the afternoon crept across the floorboards. Finally, the heavy latch lifted. Silas stepped back inside. He did not look angry anymore. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the heavy burden of his own memories. His massive shoulders slumped as he removed his weathered hat, shaking the cold mist from its wide brim. He looked toward the kitchen and saw Evelyn sitting quietly by the stove. The table was immaculate. The broken bowl was gone. A fresh pot of simple water boiled on the iron grates. Silas paused, his dark eyes studying her fragile, composed face. He did not apologize. Words were clumsy, useless tools for a man who had forgotten how to speak his heart. Instead, he gave a short, rough nod. His deep voice rumbled low in his massive chest. The logging crews will come down from the high timber before dusk. They are hungry men. If you can feed them, you have a place by the fire. Evelyn stood up slowly, a quiet relief washing over her trembling frame. It was a silent agreement, a fragile pact forged in the cold mountain air. She belonged here, at least for tonight. She nodded her head, her eyes bright with sudden, fierce determination. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, the boarding house swelled with noise. A dozen rough, soot-stained loggers filed into the common room. They were loud, boisterous men, their heavy boots tracking mud across the braided rugs. They laughed and shouted, demanding hot food and strong coffee. Evelyn remained in the kitchen, her heart racing as she observed the chaotic crowd. They were exactly the kind of men who terrified her in the valley towns. But Silas did not let them cross the threshold into her sanctuary. The giant mountain man positioned himself deliberately between the dining room and the kitchen archway. He stood like an ancient, immovable oak tree, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He did not need to issue a warning. His sheer size and cold, silent stare served as a perfect shield. No man dared step past him. He was a reluctant protector, offering her the one thing she desperately needed, absolute safety. Behind his massive silhouette, Evelyn moved with purpose. She opened her battered leather journal, her fingers tracing the faded ink of another wartime survival meal. She needed a stretch pantry to feed 12 massive men. She selected a recipe born of deep scarcity, a toasted cornmeal and root vegetable hash, enriched with the heavy fat of the salt pork. She pulled 3 massive cast iron skillets onto the roaring stove. The heat in the kitchen grew intense. The heavy iron was far too cumbersome for her fragile wrists, but she refused to surrender. She gripped the hot iron handles with thick cloths, biting her lip against the burning strain. Silas turned his head. He watched her struggle, with the heavy skillets. He stepped away from his post and entered the kitchen. He did not ask for permission. He simply reached out and took the heavy iron handle from her delicate grip. His massive, calloused hands moved the scalding skillets with effortless grace. A quiet, synchronized routine began to unfold between them. They did not exchange a single word. They communicated entirely through the rhythm of shared labor. Evelyn pointed to the chopped root vegetables. Silas swept them onto the hot iron. Evelyn reached for the wooden spoon. Silas handed it to her before she could ask. He managed the heavy fire. She managed the delicate balance of the flavors. The kitchen became a silent dance. Every time they passed a skillet or reached for the salt, their hands moved in perfect harmony, avoiding collision by mere inches. The stoic, scarred veteran and the beautiful, suffering widow found a strange, peaceful sanctuary in the heat of the hearth. Silas watched her face glow in the firelight. He marveled at how someone so physically delicate could command such resilient, life-giving power. The profound tension of the morning melted away, replaced by the quiet, steady foundation of building trust. She did not fear his silence, and he did not judge her fragility. The scent of toasted cornmeal and rich pork fat filled the boarding house. The loud loggers grew quiet, their stomachs rumbling at the promise of a truly hearty meal. Evelyn stirred the final skillet, the hash turning a beautiful, golden brown. The meal was almost perfect. She wiped the sweat from her brow and looked down at the leather journal. She read the fading instructions one last time. Then, she reached deep into the pocket of her faded pastel dress and pulled out a tiny, tightly tied canvas pouch. She glanced up to ensure the loggers could not see her. Silas stood in the shadow of the pantry, watching her every move. Evelyn untied the pouch. She did not measure the contents. She pinched a very small amount of a dark, fragrant dust between her delicate fingers and sprinkled it slowly over the bubbling food. She then carefully tucked the pouch back into her pocket and deliberately closed the journal. From the ache, running her hand over a specific page where an entire line had been intentionally crossed out with thick, black ink, Silas narrowed his sharp eyes, his curiosity suddenly burning brighter than the iron stove. He recognized the smell of the meal, but the final addition carried an unfamiliar, deeply intoxicating scent. What was the secret ingredient Evelyn explicitly refused to write down in the book? The bitter mountain winds stripped the final autumn leaves from the oak trees, signaling the approach of a brutal winter. Yet, inside the timber walls of the isolated boarding house, a profound and unfamiliar warmth began to take root. The mysterious, dark dust Evelyn had sprinkled into the heavy iron skillet that first night had completely transformed the course meal. The loggers had eaten in stunned silence, scraping their tin plates clean, mesmerized by a depth of flavor they had never encountered in the high country. Word of the remarkable food spread down the muddy logging trails and across the treacherous mountain passes with the speed of a wild brush fire. Within 2 weeks, the desolate sanctuary Silas had maintained for years was utterly unrecognizable. The rhythm of their days settled into a steady, reliable duet of flour and firewood. Before the sun crested the jagged eastern peaks, the sharp, rhythmic crack of an axe echoed across the frost-covered yard. Silas split massive logs of pine and hickory, his massive muscles working flawlessly in the biting cold to ensure the hearth never faltered. Inside, the soft, methodical thud of fragile hands kneading heavy dough resonated against the wooden kitchen table. Evelyn commanded the kitchen with a quiet, unyielding grace. Her pastel dress, now carefully mended at the hem, remained a stark symbol of her delicate nature amidst the rough, unforgiving frontier. Travelers who normally bypassed the high pass began to alter their long routes. stagecoach drivers, weary fur trappers, and rugged cattlemen filled the common room every evening. They did not come for the cheap ale. They came for the profound comfort radiating from the kitchen. Evelyn utilized the battered leather journal daily, resurrecting forgotten wartime meals that stretched humble rations into magnificent feasts of survival. She baked thick, dark loaves of molasses bread that steamed beautifully in the cold air. She slow-roasted wild game with dried mountain berries, creating a sweet and savory aroma that wrapped around the exhausted travelers like a heavy wool blanket. The men spoke in hushed, respectful tones when she entered the room, instinctively removing their dusty hats in the presence of such refined, gentle dignity. Silas watched it all from the deep shadows of the room. He was a man accustomed to profound isolation, a silent ghost haunting his own life. Yet, as he observed the slender widow move through the crowded room, a deep, undeniable admiration began to thaw the ancient ice in his massive chest. He stood near the doorway, his massive arms crossed over his coarse shirt, acting as an ever-present, silent guardian. He watched the firelight dance across her delicate facial features. He saw the sheer exhaustion masking her eyes, but he also saw the iron will that kept her standing. She was the most physically vulnerable creature he had ever known, yet she possessed a strength that rivaled the very mountains outside. She was breathing life back into his desolate world, one loaf of bread and one warm bowl of stew at a time. He had spent years trying to forget the worth of humanity, believing that people only brought pain and senseless destruction. Yet, watching Evelyn pour her entire spirit into a simple meal, he realized that true beauty still existed in the dark world. Her resilience was a quiet, undeniable force. The way she moved around the heavy iron stove, managing the violent heat with a practiced, elegant dance, fascinated him deeply. He noticed the small, telling details. He noticed how she always saved the softest piece of bread for the oldest traveler in the room. He noticed how she wiped down the heavy timber tables until the wood gleamed, treating the rough establishment with the profound reverence of a grand cathedral. Most of all, he noticed the way she avoided looking at the heavy oak door whenever the wind howled, a lingering terror still gripping her fragile heart. She was healing his home, but she remained deeply, painfully broken herself. Late one evening, the common room began to empty as the exhausted men sought their beds in the loft. The fire burned down to a deep, glowing red. Silas stood by the window, watching the heavy snow begin to fall upon the dark pines. The heavy oak door groaned loudly, and a lone figure stepped inside. It was an older trader, a man who drove supplies between the isolated mountain camps and the prosperous valley towns far below. He was half frozen, his long beard crusted with thick white ice. Evelyn immediately emerged from the kitchen, holding a steaming mug of hot chicory coffee. She placed it gently upon the table before the shivering man. The trader wrapped his stiff hands around the warm clay, nodding his profound gratitude. Silas approached the table, his massive boots making no sound on the heavy floorboards. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down opposite the weary trader. He did not ask for news, but the trader knew the giant mountain man expected a complete report of the valley roads. The trader took a long, slow sip of the dark coffee, his eyes fluttering shut in sheer relief. He opened his eyes slowly and looked up at the towering figure of Silas. The roads are freezing fast. The valley is filled with snow, and it brings strange people to the lower settlements. Silas narrowed his sharp eyes, his massive shoulders tensing slightly beneath his rough fabric. The trader leaned closer, dropping his voice to a low, conspiratorial murmur. A man arrived in the valley town 3 days ago on the eastern train. He does not belong in this rough country. He wears a tailored city suit, a heavy silk tie, and carries a walking stick topped with polished silver. He possesses a cruel look in his eye, the exact kind of look a hungry wolf gives a wounded lamb. Evelyn paused near the dark archway of the kitchen, the empty tin tray in her delicate hands suddenly trembling. The color drained entirely from her fragile face. The traitor continued, oblivious to the terrifying silence consuming the room behind him. He is asking harsh questions at every tavern and every general store. He throws heavy silver coins onto the wooden counters, demanding immediate information. He is looking for a woman. A young, slender woman. A widow, he claims loudly, who ran away in the middle of the night. Silas slowly turned his massive head toward the kitchen. He saw Evelyn gripping the wooden door frame, her delicate knuckles turning pure white, her breath trapped completely in her throat. The deep, unspoken fear she had carried up the frozen mountain was no longer a phantom in the wind. The past had finally tracked her down. Silas turned his dark, intense gaze back to the shivering traitor. The quiet sanctuary they had built over the last few weeks was about to face a brutal storm. Who is the well-dressed stranger asking questions about a runaway widow down in the valley town? The shivering traitor did not linger. He recognized the terrifying, protective fury igniting behind the dark eyes of the giant mountain man, and he knew the approaching blizzard would soon bury the high pass under 10 feet of deadly white powder. He drank the last of his warm chicory coffee, pulled his heavy collar up against the freezing draft, and vanished back into the night. Within an hour, the sky broke open. A furious mountain blizzard descended upon the isolated boarding house, howling like a chorus of forgotten ghosts. The wind slammed against the heavy timber walls, burying the windows in thick, impenetrable ice. The brutal storm severed them entirely from the world below. They were completely alone. Evelyn remained standing by the dark archway of the kitchen, her fragile body trembling violently. The crushing terror of the valley stranger had stolen the breath from her lungs. The fragile sanctuary she had built among the flower and the firewood felt suddenly useless against the creeping shadow of her past. She expected Silas to demand answers. She expected him to ask about the debts, the runaway rumors, and the cruel man hunting her. Silas did not ask a single question. The massive man simply walked to the heavy oak door and dropped a thick iron bar across the latch with a resounding, definitive clang. He moved to the windows, pulling the heavy wool curtains shut, sealing the warmth inside. He then walked toward the hearth, feeding 3 massive hickory logs into the roaring fire. He stood before the flames, his broad back to her, an immovable mountain of silent, absolute protection. He would not let the world touch her. Evelyn needed to quiet her racing heart. She needed the familiar, grounding rhythm of survival. She retreated into the warm kitchen and opened the battered leather journal to a page stained with old flour and dried water drops. She chose a recipe born of profound desperation, hardtack. It was the absolute lowest form of wartime sustenance, a brutal mixture of flour and water baked into a brick to keep marching men alive. But Evelyn would not bake despair tonight. She gathered the coarse flour, adding a generous measure of precious wild mountain honey and a handful of dried summer apples she had discovered hidden in the back of the cold pantry. She poured her frantic, terrified energy into the heavy dough. Her delicate hands worked the mixture against the pale timber table, kneading the sweet honey into the coarse flour. She rolled the dough flat, cutting it into thick squares, and pierced the tops with a heavy iron fork to let the steam escape. She placed the heavy iron tray directly into the intense heat of the oven. The storm raged violently against the roof, but inside the kitchen, the aroma of toasting flour, sweet hot honey, and baked apples began to rise. It did not smell like a miserable wartime ration. It smelled like endurance, sweetened by the desperate hope for a better tomorrow. Silas turned away from the fire. The scent drifted across the common room, carrying an invisible, heavy weight. He walked slowly into the kitchen, his massive frame filling the narrow space. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down at the table, his dark eyes fixed upon the iron stove. Evelyn pulled the tray from the oven. The hardtack squares were golden brown, bubbling slightly at the edges from the hot honey. She placed a warm square onto a tin plate and set it gently before the silent giant. She poured a cup of fresh water and sat opposite him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Silas picked up the heavy, dense biscuit. He looked at it for a long time, the shadows dancing across his scarred, weathered face. He took a slow bite. The crunch was loud in the quiet room, followed immediately by the unexpected, soothing sweetness of the honey and the soft warmth of the baked apple. The massive man closed his eyes. The breath shuddered violently in his massive chest. When he opened his eyes, the ancient, impenetrable walls of his stoic restraint completely shattered. The sweetened ration did not bring forth the bitter anger of the dark broth. It brought forth the profound, crushing sorrow of survival. His deep, rumbling voice broke the silence, vibrating with a raw, bleeding vulnerability. We marched for 3 days through the freezing mud of Virginia without a single fire. My men were starving. They were boys, mostly farm boys who missed their mothers. On the final night, we found a single barrel of ruined flour. We mixed it with river water and baked it on hot stones. It tasted like ash and despair. Evelyn did not move. She scarcely breathed, allowing him the absolute safety to finally release the heavy burden he had carried for so many years. Silas stared at the half-eaten biscuit in his calloused hand, his dark eyes shining with unshed tears. I was their captain. I was a massive man, built to shield them. I told them to eat. I promised them the morning would bring relief. But the morning only brought the artillery fire. His voice dropped to a devastating, broken whisper. I survived because of my size. I survived because the terrible iron and lead could not break my bones. But I could not save them. I could not protect them. I ate the bitter ash, and I lived, while the boys who trusted me vanished into the smoke. I have spent every day since believing that I do not deserve the warmth of a fire or the sweet taste of a meal. Evelyn felt the hot tears spill over her pale cheeks. She understood the crushing weight of surviving when all was lost. She did not offer empty pity or clumsy reassurances. Instead, she reached across the pale timber table. Her fragile, trembling fingers gently covered his massive, battle-scared hand. He did not pull away. For the first time in a decade, the giant mountain man allowed himself to be comforted. The fierce winter storm screamed outside, but within the quiet kitchen, a profound, sacred bond of shared vulnerability anchored them together. The fire slowly died down to glowing red embers, casting the room in deep, quiet shadow. The silence stretched out, rich and incredibly intimate. Silas leaned his heavy head back against the chair, the raw emotion draining the last of his immense strength. He looked at the fragile woman sitting beside him in the dark. His massive chest heaved with a slow, heavy sigh. He murmured a quiet, devastating confession into the shadows, a secret admission of his own heart that he could never unsay. What confession did Silas whisper into the dark that he might deeply regret by morning? The brutal mountain blizzard finally broke on the dawn of the 4th day, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence and snowdrifts that reached the lower windows of the boarding house. The stranded travelers had consumed nearly every ounce of the emergency rations. The heavy sacks of coarse flour lay empty. The salt pork was gone. The precious wild honey and dried summer apples had been entirely depleted to bake the sweetened hardtack. The boarding house had survived the freezing fury of the storm, but it now faced the very real threat of starvation. They had no choice. They had to harness the massive draft horses to the heavy timber wagon and make the treacherous, ice-slick journey down into the valley town. Evelyn sat rigidly beside Silas on the high wooden bench of the wagon. She clutched the thick blanket tightly around her delicate shoulders, her breath pluming in the freezing morning air. The fear she had managed to bury during the blizzard returned with terrifying force. The valley town was where the cruel, well-dressed stranger was hunting her. It was a place of judgment, debt, and suffocating societal rules. Yet, she did not tremble. She glanced sideways at the giant mountain man, guiding the massive horses with effortless, powerful restraint. The secret confession he had whispered in the dark kitchen had forged an unbreakable chain of shared vulnerability between them. He had trusted her with his deepest shame, and in return, she found a strange, blooming courage in his imposing shadow. The wagon descended out of the pristine mountain timber and entered the bustling, coal-choked streets of the valley settlement. The contrast was immediate and entirely overwhelming. The town was thriving, fueled by the aggressive expansion of the Eastern Railroad. Wealthy merchants and mine owners walked the wooden boardwalks in heavy wool coats and tailored suits. Their wives glided past in immaculate velvet dresses and fur-lined cloaks. Evelyn felt deeply, painfully exposed. Her pastel dress, though meticulously mended and washed, still bore the permanent, faint stains of mountain mud. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate, penniless widow clinging to the very edge of survival. Silas pulled the heavy wagon to a halt before the largest mercantile in the settlement. He wrapped the thick leather reins around the iron brake. His deep voice rumbled quietly, carrying a profound, anchoring steadiness. Gather exactly what you require for the kitchen. Do not settle for spoiled goods. I will secure the heavy grain and the iron tools from the loading dock in the rear. Evelyn nodded, her fragile fingers clutching her battered leather journal. She stepped down from the wagon and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the mercantile. The interior was a cavern of overwhelming prosperity. Polished wooden shelves held imported canned peaches, refined white sugar, delicate porcelain tea sets, and fine silk ribbons. It was a world that had fiercely rejected her months ago. She kept her eyes cast downward, navigating past the opulent displays. She moved deliberately toward the dark, dusty corners of the store, seeking the humble, ignored provisions that matched the forgotten wartime recipes in her book. She found a heavy barrel of coarse buckwheat. She located a large tin of cheap sorghum molasses, a bundle of dried chicory roots, and a heavy sack of unrefined rock salt. She carried the heavy items to the polished mahogany counter, her slender arms straining under the immense weight. 3 wealthy townswomen stood near the brass register, examining a bolt of expensive imported lace. They paused their conversation. Their sharp, calculating eyes swept over Evelyn, taking in her thin shawl, her scarred hands, and the frayed hem of her faded pastel dress. A cruel, condescending whisper cut through the warm air of the store. Look at the absolute state of that creature. She drags the filthy mountain mud directly onto the clean floorboards. Another woman let out a short, mocking laugh, her gaze fixed upon the humble ingredients Evelyn had placed upon the counter. Coarse buckwheat and sorghum. She is buying peasant swill. I heard a rumor that the terrifying giant up at the pass took in a runaway beggar to scrub his floors. It seems the brute finally found a companion suited to his miserable, savage existence. Evelyn froze. The burning heat of profound humiliation flushed her pale cheeks. The store clerk, a sharp-featured man in a crisp white apron, sneered openly at her. He deliberately ignored her presence, turning his back to arrange a display of expensive cigars. Evelyn felt the walls of the store closing in. The instinct to flee, to abandon the precious ingredients and run back to the safety of the freezing wagon, screamed in her mind. Her hands trembled violently as she reached out to pull her thin shawl over her head to hide her face. The brass bell above the heavy glass door did not simply ring. It violently shattered the quiet murmur of the store. The heavy door swung open, hitting the wooden wall with a deafening crack. The sunlight in the room seemed to instantly vanish, eclipsed entirely by the massive, towering silhouette stepping over the threshold. Silas entered the mercantile. He did not walk. He advanced with the terrifying, inevitable momentum of a mountain avalanche. His weathered hat cast a deep shadow over his sharp, furious eyes. The immense breadth of his muscular shoulders forced the wealthy patrons to physically step back in sudden, instinctual fear. The mocking townswoman gasped, their cruel smiles vanishing instantly. The store clerk dropped a box of cigars, his hands shaking as the giant mountain man crossed the room in 3 massive strides. Silas stopped directly beside Evelyn. He looked down at her trembling hands, then turned his dark, piercing gaze upon the terrified women and the arrogant clerk. He did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice. His low, rumbling words possessed the devastating weight of falling iron. Ring up the provisions. The clerk scrambled to the brass register, his fingers fumbling in sheer panic. Silas reached into his heavy coat and withdrew a solid gold coin, a relic from his forgotten past. He slammed it onto the polished mahogany counter. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the silent store. He moved his massive frame slightly, placing himself entirely between the cruel townspeople and the fragile widow. He looked directly at the wealthy women. This woman is the absolute heart of my establishment. She possesses more dignity in her calloused hands than exists in this entire valley. She is under my direct protection. Any disrespect shown to her will be answered directly by me. Evelyn stopped, trembling. A sudden, overwhelming wave of fierce, undeniable loyalty crashed over her fragile heart. He was not merely sheltering her out of pity. He was publicly claiming her as his equal, demanding the world respect her worth. As she looked up at his strong, scarred jawline, the quiet gratitude she had harbored transformed instantly into a deep, profound, romantic longing. He was her absolute safety, and she was falling deeply in love with him. The humiliated town elite retreated in silence, their faces pale with outrage and offended pride. They possessed deep pockets, powerful connections, and absolute control over the freight lines that supplied the high pass. As the heavy wagon rolled out of the valley, the wealthy merchants exchanged venomous, calculating glances. Will the humiliated town elite organize a brutal freight boycott to starve the boarding house into complete ruin? The heavy timber wagon crawled slowly up the treacherous, ice-slicked pass, leaving the cruel judgment of the valley settlement far behind them. The silence shared between Evelyn and Silas upon the high wooden bench was no longer born of fear or awkward hesitation. It was a deep, resonant quiet, heavy with the profound shift in their dynamic. He had stood before the wealthy elite and claimed her as his equal. He had forged a protective shield around her fragile existence, using nothing but his massive presence and his unwavering honor. Evelyn clutched the thick wool blanket around her delicate shoulders, stealing cautious, sidelong glances at his hardened, weathered profile. The bitter mountain wind bit at her pale cheeks, but a strange, undeniable warmth had firmly planted its roots deep within her chest. She was no longer a discarded stray fighting for a single breath. She belonged to this mountain now. They arrived at the boarding house, just as the fading afternoon light painted the snow-covered pines in deep shades of violet and gray. The grand, isolated structure stood waiting for them, completely silent and remarkably safe. Silas unhitched the massive draft horses, leading them into the warm barn, while Evelyn carried the humble provisions into the kitchen. She unpacked the coarse buckwheat and the heavy tin of sorghum molasses with profound reverence. Alongside the heavy grain, Silas had procured a massive burlap sack of bruised, late-season apples from the loading dock. They were ugly, battered by the frost, and entirely unwanted by the wealthy townspeople. Evelyn knew exactly what to do with them. When Silas entered the kitchen, stomping the heavy snow from his boots, the iron stove was already roaring. Evelyn had opened her battered leather journal, her delicate fingers tracing a page stained with dark, sweet spots. It was a recipe for apple leather, a critical wartime method for preserving damaged fruit through the long, desolate winters. It required peeling the bruised fruit, simmering the flesh into a thick, concentrated paste, and spreading it over stretched canvas near the radiant heat of the hearth to dry into sweet, sustaining strips. She stood at the pale timber table, surrounded by the mountain of bruised red apples. She held a small iron paring knife, her fragile hands moving with practiced, methodical grace. A long, curling ribbon of red skin fell into a wooden bucket at her feet. Silas removed his heavy, snow-dusted coat and hung his weathered hat upon the wooden peg. He walked to the wash basin, scrubbing the icy mud from his massive, calloused hands. He did not retreat to the shadows of the common room. Instead, he pulled a heavy wooden chair up to the pale timber table, sitting directly beside her. His deep, rumbling voice filled the warm kitchen. You will ruin your hands attempting to clear that entire sack before nightfall. Give me a knife. Evelyn looked up, her heart performing a sudden, erratic flutter against her ribs. She handed him a second paring knife. He looked absolutely ridiculous, holding the tiny iron tool. His massive, scarred fingers completely dwarfed the handle, and his forearms, thick with heavy muscle, rested upon the table, taking up half the available space. Yet, as he picked up a bruised apple, his movements possessed an astonishing, deliberate gentleness. He peeled the fruit with absolute precision, ensuring not a single ounce of the precious flesh was wasted. The physical proximity was entirely overwhelming. The kitchen was a utilitarian space, never designed for two people to work in such close quarters, especially when one of those people was a giant mountain man. Every time he shifted his massive frame, his thick thigh brushed against the soft fabric of her mended pastel dress. Every time she reached for another apple, her slender arm hovered mere inches from his broad chest. The air between them grew incredibly thick, charged with a heavy, magnetic tension. The harsh, freezing world outside simply ceased to exist. There was only the rhythmic, metallic scrape of the paring knives, the sweet, intoxicating aroma of simmering fruit filling the room, and the comforting blast of heat radiating from the iron stove. They worked for hours as the darkness swallowed the windows. They fell into a seamless, quiet rhythm, peeling, coring, and dropping the pale fruit into the heavy iron pot. Evelyn reached into the burlap sack at the exact moment Silas reached forward. Her delicate, pale fingers collided directly with his massive, calloused knuckles. Evelyn gasped softly, instinctively freezing. She fully expected him to pull away, to retreat behind his ancient walls of stoic restraint. Silas did not move his hand away. Slowly, deliberately, the giant mountain man turned his palm upward. He opened his massive fingers and gently, carefully, enveloped her tiny hand within his own. The sheer size of his hand completely swallowed hers, Yet he held her with the profound reverence one might use to hold a fragile, injured bird. His thick, rough thumb slowly brushed across her delicate knuckles, tracing the fading scars she had earned from months of brutal labor. The touch was incredibly warm, anchoring, and devastatingly intimate. Evelyn stopped breathing entirely. She looked up, slowly, her wide, trembling eyes meeting his dark, intense gaze. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, vibrating with unspoken confessions and a terrifying, beautiful longing. The fierce protector had lowered his guard entirely, offering her the one thing she had craved since the day she lost everything: absolute emotional safety. She felt the heavy, suffocating walls around her own heart beginning to crumble into fine dust. She wanted to lean into his massive chest. She wanted to surrender the immense burden of her grief. Suddenly, a violent shudder ripped through her fragile frame. The profound, beautiful safety of his touch triggered a catastrophic chain reaction deep within her wounded mind. The absolute certainty that she was falling deeply in love with him collided violently with the terrifying reality of her hidden, inescapable debts. She was a hunted woman, a curse upon anyone who dared to love her. Evelyn ripped her delicate hand out of his massive grip as if his touch had turned to burning iron. She pushed her chair back violently, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards. She backed away from the pale timber table, her breathing ragged, her fragile face twisting in sudden, unendurable agony. Tears spilled over her pale cheeks, falling onto the mended collar of her pastel dress. She turned and fled into the dark hallway, leaving the giant man sitting in stunned, heartbreaking silence. Why did the beautiful widow suddenly pull away and burst into tears the moment she felt truly, undeniably safe? Silas was sitting at the pale timber table long after Evelyn had fled into the dark hallway. He stared down at his massive, calloused hands. The profound warmth of her delicate fingers lingered upon his rough skin like a phantom. He did not chase her. He understood the desperate instinct of a deeply wounded creature to seek the shadows when the light became too intense. He rose slowly, his massive chest tight with a heavy, unfamiliar ache, and began to methodically clear the mountain of bruised apple peels. He would give her the space she required, but he would not withdraw his protection. The morning arrived with the blinding, brutal brilliance of winter's sun reflecting off fresh, deep snow. The boarding house remained painfully quiet. Evelyn finally emerged from the hallway, her fragile face incredibly pale, her delicate eyes red and swollen from a long night of silent weeping. She moved directly toward the iron stove, avoiding his dark gaze entirely. She retreated into her familiar, necessary armor of domestic labor, pulling a heavy iron pot forward to boil the morning water. Silas watched her from the deep shadows of the common room. He desperately wanted to speak, to assure her of her absolute safety on his mountain. But the clumsy words trapped themselves permanently in his throat. A sudden, sharp sound shattered the quiet tension of the room. It was not the heavy, hesitant thud of an exhausted traveler seeking refuge from the cold. It was a sharp, demanding, arrogant strike against the heavy oak door. Silas stood up, his massive shoulders tensed instantly beneath his coarse fabric shirt. He walked to the door and lifted the heavy iron bar. He pulled the thick wood open, allowing the freezing mountain wind to rush into the warm room. A man stood upon the frost-covered porch. He absolutely did not belong on the rough frontier. He wore a heavy overcoat lined with dark velvet, a perfectly tailored suit, and a pristine silk cravat. He held a polished walking stick, topped with a heavy, snarling silver wolf head. Two rough, heavily armed mercenaries stood immediately behind him, their unwashed hands resting cautiously upon the leather grips of their heavy revolvers. The well-dressed stranger spoke with a sharp, nasal tone, his voice dripping with arrogant condescension. I am seeking the proprietor of this remote establishment. Silas blocked the threshold completely, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the men. You have found him. State your business and leave my porch. The stranger sneered, pulling a thick stack of folded, legally stamped papers from his tailored coat. I represent the primary creditors of the late Jonathan Vance. I am tracking a dangerous fugitive. His widow fled her legal obligations in the eastern cities. She is a criminal, deeply indebted to her late husband's brother, who now rightfully owns all outstanding ledgers and properties. Evelyn stood entirely frozen in the dark archway of the kitchen. The heavy iron spoon slipped from her delicate, trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the hard floorboards. The sound immediately drew the sharp, calculating eyes of the stranger. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his pristine face. There is the runaway, looking precisely as wretched as her dead husband left her. The two armed mercenaries stepped forwards simultaneously, their heavy boots crunching loudly upon the frozen timber of the porch. Silas did not flinch. He shifted his immense weight, his massive frame expanding to fill the entire doorway. He instantly became an impenetrable, breathing wall of hardened muscle and violent, protective potential. Silas glared down at the arrogant stranger. You will not take a single step into my home. The stranger tapped his silver walking stick aggressively against the frozen wood. You do not understand the gravity of this situation. Mountain Man. Her husband was an absolute fool who gambled away massive factories and family fortunes. He died a coward, leaving his fragile bride to face the absolute ruin. Under the strict laws of our state, the debt transfers entirely to the surviving spouse. She owes her brother-in-law an impossible, astronomical sum. If she cannot pay the ledger in full, she will return to the city in heavy iron chains to work the factory floors until her hands bleed to the bone. Evelyn pressed her back against the rough timber wall of the kitchen, her lungs screaming for air. The terrifying, inescapable truth was finally exposed to the light. She was betrayed by blood, condemned to slavery by a cruel marriage she could not escape. The crushing weight of the debt was a sum no humble mountain establishment could ever dream of earning in 10 lifetimes. The stranger raised the thick stack of legal papers, waving them in the freezing air. I demand immediate payment in full, or I demand the woman. I possess the absolute legal authority to bind her wrists right now. Silas looked over his massive shoulder. He saw Evelyn, her delicate frame shaking violently, her eyes wide with the absolute, suffocating terror of a trapped animal. The beautiful sanctuary they had built over the simmering pots and shared, quiet labor was crumbling rapidly under the weight of Eastern ink and cruel men. Silas turned his dark, intense gaze back to the stranger. His deep voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated powerfully through the floorboards. She owes you absolutely nothing. You will turn your men around, and you will walk down this frozen mountain. If you dare draw those weapons on my land, the spring thaw will not find your bodies. The armed mercenaries hesitated, taking a slow, cautious step backward. The giant mountain man was not offering a boastful threat. He was stating a simple, inevitable fact of frontier survival. The well-dressed stranger scowled fiercely, his arrogant composure cracking slightly beneath the intense intimidation. He tucked the heavy legal papers forcefully back into his velvet coat. You are making a profound, fatal mistake. You cannot fight the law and the massive eastern banks with simple brute force. I will ride down to the valley settlement today. I will return in exactly 2 days with the regional sheriff, a federal writ, and enough armed men to burn this miserable shack to the ground. The stranger turned sharply and marched away into the snow, his armed guards following closely behind. Silas slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the thick iron bar back into place with a deafening crash. Evelyn collapsed entirely to her knees in the dark hallway. She buried her fragile face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with uncontrollable, desperate sobs. Her fear of loss was absolute and crushing. She had finally found a place of true belonging, a man of profound honor, and now she was going to bring his entire world crashing down into ash. Silas walked slowly toward her. He knelt upon the hard floorboards, his massive presence offering a silent, heavy anchor in the chaotic center of her panic. Evelyn looked up, her delicate face streaming with hot tears. Her voice broke, shattered completely by her despair. I must leave immediately. I must pack my bag tonight and walk into the snow. They will take your home. They will destroy everything you have built. I am a terrible curse upon this mountain. Silas looked down at her fragile, weeping form. He did not agree. He slowly turned his head, his sharp dark eyes gazing toward the heavy timber walls of the boarding house, and beyond them, out toward the vast, priceless acres of pristine high timber he had owned since the end of the terrible war. The arrogant stranger demanded an impossible sum of money to satisfy the cruel brother-in-law. The massive mountain man possessed only one thing of such immense, undeniable value. Will Silas sell his precious mountain land to pay the debt of a woman he barely knows? The freezing shadows of the narrow hallway seemed to press violently inward as Evelyn scrambled to gather her meager belongings. She possessed almost nothing of true value in this world, making her frantic packing a swift and deeply pathetic endeavor. She folded her damp shawl with violently trembling hands, shoving it blindly into a small, frayed canvas sack alongside her waterlogged boots and a single spare apron. She could not pull a full breath into her lungs. The suffocating, absolute terror of the well-dressed stranger had completely shattered her fragile composure. She firmly believed she was a living curse, a walking plague of misfortune that would inevitably destroy the quiet, honorable giant who had saved her life. She reached for her battered leather journal, her fingers slipping upon the smooth cover. A massive, calloused hand descended from the dark space above her, gently but immovably clamping over her delicate wrist. Silas stood in the narrow hallway, completely blocking her path to the heavy oak door. His immense frame absorbed all the available light, casting her into a deep, protective shadow. He did not appear angry. He appeared deeply, resolutely grounded. He reached down with his free hand and effortlessly lifted the canvas sack from the floorboards, tossing it casually into the far corner of the room. His deep, rumbling voice vibrated through the silent air, carrying the absolute weight of a mountain stone. You will not walk into the snow. You will not surrender to cruel men who deal in paper and fear. Evelyn shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling over her pale cheeks. They will burn your boarding house to the ground. They will take your pristine timberland. I cannot allow my past to destroy your sanctuary. I am a broken thing, and I bring only ruin. Silas stepped closer, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate calm. He slowly released her delicate wrist, moving his massive hand upward to gently cup her tear-stained cheek. His rough thumb wiped away the hot moisture. I survived a war that burned the entire world to ash. A petty Eastern creditor with a silver walking stick does not frighten me. You brought life back into this desolate structure. You are not a curse. The absolute, unyielding certainty in his dark eyes acted as a heavy anchor, arresting her spiraling panic. The violent trembling in her slender limbs began to slowly subside, replaced by a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. The adrenaline drained entirely from her blood, leaving her fragile and dangerously hollow. She needed the familiar, grounding rhythm of her survival. She desperately needed her healing routine. Evelyn turned away from the cold hallway and walked slowly toward the kitchen. She stoked the iron stove until the embers roared back to life, the intense heat washing over her pale face. She opened her battered leather journal to a page, heavily stained with dark, fragrant smudges. During the darkest years of the war, when the blockade severed the supply lines, true coffee beans became an impossible luxury. Desperate families had turned to the deep earth for salvation. She retrieved the small burlap sack of dried chicory roots she had purchased in the valley settlement. She placed a heavy iron skillet directly over the open flame. When the metal was radiating intense heat, she dropped the tough, dried roots into the pan. She did not rush. The methodical, rhythmic motion of stirring the roots required absolute focus, pushing the terrifying image of the arrogant stranger out of her mind. The chicory began to roast, releasing a thick, earthy, and profoundly dark aroma into the kitchen. It smelled of deep soil, wood smoke, and undeniable resilience. Once the roots were completely charred and brittle, she transferred them to a heavy wooden mortar. She brought the heavy stone pestle down, crushing the roasted roots into a coarse, dark powder. The physical exertion demanded her remaining strength, but with every strike of the stone, a small fraction of her suffocating fear shattered alongside the chicory. She boiled a kettle of fresh mountain water, pouring it slowly over the dark powder through a thin cloth. The liquid that bloomed into the tin pot was thick, black as midnight, and completely devoid of the refined sweetness of Eastern society. It was a harsh, bitter brew designed entirely to keep exhausted humans standing. She poured the steaming liquid into 2 battered tin cups. Silas sat at the pale timber table, watching her every deliberate movement in total silence. He understood exactly what she was doing. She was brewing courage. Evelyn walked toward the table and set the hot tin cup before him. She sat down opposite his massive frame, wrapping her delicate fingers tightly around the warm metal of her own cup. She brought the harsh brew to her lips and took a slow sip. The chicory coffee was incredibly bitter, coating her tongue with the heavy, rich taste of charred earth. It sent a sudden, vital jolt of energy rushing through her exhausted veins. Silas lifted his heavy cup. He drank the dark liquid without flinching at the bitterness. He set the tin down upon the wood with a soft clink. His intense gaze locked onto her fragile, beautiful face. We possess 2 days before that arrogant fool returns with the valley sheriff. We will not run. We will stand upon this mountain, and we will face them together. Evelyn looked into his weathered, scarred face. The absolute emotional dependence she felt at that exact moment terrified her. Yet it also filled her with a brilliant, soaring hope. He was her steadfast support, an unbreakable wall, standing between her fragile heart and a cruel world. She slowly nodded her head, accepting his profound protection. The tension in the room finally broke, leaving behind a quiet, resolute calm. The fire crackled softly in the iron stove. Silas stood up from the pale timber table. I must secure the heavy barn doors against the rising wind. He pulled his weathered coat over his massive shoulders and stepped out onto the freezing, darkened porch. The snow had begun to fall again, dusting the heavy wooden floorboards in a fine, white powder. Silas walked heavily toward the massive woodpile stacked against the side of the boarding house, exactly where the arrogant stranger and his armed guards had turned their horses around. As the giant mountain man bent down to gather a heavy oak log, a stark flash of white against the dark mud caught his sharp eye. He reached down with his calloused hand and pulled a thick, folded piece of heavy parchment from the frozen slush. It bore the heavy, pressed wax seal of an Eastern banking institution. The stranger had dropped it during his arrogant departure. Silas brushed the snow from the legal document and slowly unfolded the stiff paper in the moonlight. What hidden document did the debt collector drop by the woodpile? Silas returned to the kitchen, his massive boots heavy upon the floorboards. He laid the stiff, cold parchment upon the pale timber table. The heavy wax seal belonged to a ruthless Eastern bank. The document detailed the exact, catastrophic sum of the debt, alongside a strict demand for full payment before the week concluded. The number printed upon the page was astronomical, designed entirely to ensure absolute ruin. Evelyn stared at the dark ink, her delicate hands gripping the edge of the table. The sum was completely impossible. Silas did not look at the paper. He looked directly at her. The Great Regional Harvest Fair commences tomorrow at the lower river crossing. It draws thousands of hands from across the entire territory. Loggers, prospectors, and rivermen who possess heavy silver and a desperate hunger for true warmth. We will not wait for the storm to strike our roof. We will go down to the crossing, and we will fight. Evelyn looked into his dark, steadfast eyes. The terrified, fleeing widow vanished entirely, replaced by a woman fiercely determined to protect the man who had shielded her. She opened the battered leather journal, flipping past the delicate pastries of her past life, seeking the heavy, enduring recipes born of profound wartime struggle. She selected the slow-roasted baked beans, a recipe demanding deep earthen pits, heavy molasses, and salt pork, alongside a massive batch of dense, sweet brown breads. They worked entirely through the dark night. Silas dug a deep fire pit in the frozen earth behind the boarding house, filling it with glowing, red-hot hickory coals. Evelyn buried massive iron cauldrons filled with the soaked beans, sealing them beneath the earth to slow roast into a rich, complex perfection. She spent the remaining hours at the pale timber table, kneading massive mounds of heavy dough, her fragile arms aching with the immense effort. Silas stood beside her, managing the intense heat of the iron stove, baking the dark loaves until the kitchen smelled of deep, comforting sweetness. Dawn broke over the jagged peaks. Silas loaded the massive iron cauldrons and the heavy baskets of fresh bread into the timber wagon. They descended the mountain, arriving at the lower river crossing as the harvest fair roared to life. It was a chaotic, vibrant sea of humanity. Massive canvas tents snapped in the wind. Fiddles played lively tunes over the shouts of livestock traders. Silas secured a rough wooden stall near the center of the muddy thoroughfare. He stood towering behind the table, a giant, silent guardian, while Evelyn arranged her humble offerings. She felt a profound, lingering anxiety as she watched the wealthy valley merchants selling expensive imported meats and delicate, refined cakes nearby. Her rough, dark breads and heavy iron cauldrons looked incredibly plain in comparison. A group of exhausted, mud-stained loggers approached the stall, drawn by the thick, savory aroma rising from the deep iron pots. Evelyn offered a small tin cup of the steaming beans and a thick slice of the dark bread. The lead logger took a hesitant bite. He froze instantly. The loud, boisterous noise of the surrounding fair seemed to vanish for the rough man. The complex, incredibly rich flavor of the slow-roasted molasses, the heavy salt pork, and the deep, earthy smoke did not simply fill his empty stomach. It violently struck a chord deep within his soul. It was the exact, undeniable taste of a loving home he had not seen in decades. The logger dropped a heavy silver coin upon the wooden table, his voice thick with sudden, uncharacteristic emotion. I will take a full bowl. I will take 3 entire loaves. Word of the profound, Nostalgic food spread through the massive crowd with the speed of a prairie fire. The line before their humble stall grew incredibly long. Rough miners, weary stagecoach drivers, and hardened mountain men stood patiently in the freezing mud, eagerly handing over their silver for a simple, fleeting taste of pure comfort. Evelyn moved with a beautiful, practiced grace, serving the hot meals with a gentle smile that warmed the cold air. The profound validation she received from the humble, hard-working people acted as a powerful balm upon her wounded spirit. They did not judge her faded pastel dress. They judged the immense care she poured into their weary hands. Silas stood behind her, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He watched the massive crowd treat her with deep, undeniable reverence. He watched the heavy leather pouch upon the table fill rapidly with shining silver coins. But more importantly, he watched the profound transformation of the fragile widow. The crushing weight of her hidden shame was gone, and replaced by a radiant, triumphant pride. She was no longer a discarded victim of a cruel world. She was the absolute, beating heart of the mountain community. A deep, undeniable attachment swelled within his massive chest. He realized, with absolute certainty, that he could not endure a single day upon this earth without her light in his home. He wanted to build a permanent fortress around her, to spend the rest of his natural life keeping her warm. By the late afternoon, the massive iron cauldrons were scraped entirely clean. The heavy baskets of bread were empty. The harvest fair continued to rage around them, but their desperate labor was finished. Evelyn leaned back against the rough wooden post of the stall, wiping a smudge of dark soot from her pale forehead. She looked up at the giant mountain man, her delicate face glowing with a beautiful, exhausted triumph. She reached out, her fragile fingers briefly resting against his massive, calloused hand. We fought them today. Silas nodded slowly, a rare, breathtakingly genuine smile softening his scarred features. He gently turned his hand, his thick fingers lightly tracing her wrist. As they began to load the empty iron cauldrons back into the timber wagon, an elderly man wearing a faded, brass-buttoned coat separated from the dense crowd. He possessed sharp, intelligent eyes and leaned heavily upon a polished wooden cane. He stopped directly before the empty stall, picking up a tiny, discarded crumb of the dark molasses bread from the wooden planks. He rubbed the dark crumb between his thumb and forefinger, bringing it slowly to his nose. He closed his eyes, drawing in the lingering scent of the complex spices. The elderly man opened his eyes and stared directly at Evelyn. His voice was a raspy, haunting whisper that cut cleanly through the noise of the surrounding fare, that specific blend of charred root and dark winter spice. I have tasted that exactly one time before, on a battlefield soaked in blood, 20 years ago. Evelyn froze, the heavy iron spoon slipping from her grasp. The deep, protective shadow of Silas instantly fell over her. But the elderly man did not look away. Who recognized the unique cooking style of the beautiful widow from a past life that she did not even live? Evelyn stared at the elderly man, her mind entirely unable to process his haunting whisper. She had not lived through the terrible war. The battered leather journal she clutched so tightly had belonged to her grandmother. Yet, before she could find the breath to question the veteran about the battlefield, 20 years passed. The massive, protective shadow of Silas enveloped her completely. He did not threaten the old man, but his imposing, silent stance effectively ended the interaction. Silas gently guided her away from the crowd, his massive, calloused hand resting securely and warmly upon her delicate lower back. They retreated to the heavy timber wagon, carrying a thick leather pouch overflowing with shining silver coins. It was a king's ransom for a humble mountain kitchen, a profound testament to the life-giving value of her labor. The triumphant glow of the harvest fair began to slowly fade as the heavy wagon crawled higher into the freezing, dark mountain pass. Evelyn clutched her mended shawl tightly against the biting night wind. The mysterious words of the veteran echoed violently in her thoughts, but a much darker, far more immediate shadow loomed over her fragile heart. The well-dressed stranger had promised to return with the law. Even with the heavy pouch of silver resting upon the wooden bench between them, she harbored a terrifying certainty that the cruel Eastern creditors would never be satisfied with mere coin. They dealt in absolute control and broken spirits. Silas remained completely silent beside her, his massive hands guiding the draft horses, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the dark, swaying pines. They cleared the final icy ridge. The familiar, comforting silhouette of the massive boarding house finally coming into view against the starlit sky. Silas pulled the thick leather reins back violently. The massive draft horses halted, their hot breath pluming in the freezing air. The heavy oak door of the boarding house stood wide open, spilling harsh, unnatural yellow light out onto the frost-covered porch. Dozens of fresh, deep boot tracks heavily marred the pristine snow in the yard. A foul, acrid smell drifted on the wind. It was the heavy scent of imported tobacco smoke, entirely defiling the lingering, sweet aroma of the baked molasses breads Evelyn had worked so hard to create. Silas reached beneath the wooden bench, his massive fingers wrapping seamlessly around the cold iron grip of a heavy, repeating rifle. He stepped down from the wagon, his massive frame radiating a sudden, terrifying lethality. He raised his free hand, motioning strictly for Evelyn to stay behind his broad back. They crossed the wooden porch, the floorboards groaning under the immense weight of the giant mountain man. Silas stepped through the threshold, the heavy rifle held firmly at his side. The warmth of the common room was utterly ruined. 6 rough, heavily armed men stood completely still in the deep shadows of the room, their unwashed hands resting firmly upon the leather grips of their holstered weapons. They were hardened mercenaries, hired killers brought up from the violent edge of the rail lines. Sitting perfectly relaxed at the pale timber table in the very center of the kitchen was a man who cast a shadow far colder than the brutal mountain winter. It was Arthur Vance. He wore a heavy overcoat of immaculate dark wool, his sharp, aristocratic features twisted into a cruel, highly satisfied sneer. He was the older brother of her late husband. He was the man who held the absolute, legal destruction of Evelyn within his manicured hands. He did not look like a businessman arriving to collect a simple financial ledger. He looked exactly like a starving predator who had finally cornered a terrified, exhausted fawn. Arthur picked up the small tin cup that still smelled faintly of bitter chicory, turning it slowly and disrespectfully in his fingers. He spoke with a sharp, nasal voice that sounded like shattering ice. You made a tremendous, noisy spectacle of yourself today, down at the river crossing. Did you truly believe you could sell peasant bread to buy your freedom? I heard the rumors of a runaway widow acting as a scullery maid for a mountain brute, and I came to see the pathetic reality for myself. He dropped the tin cup. It clattered loudly against the pale timber table. You belong entirely to me. Your husband gambled away my factories, and the law dictates that you must absorb his absolute ruin. Your labor, your breath, your absolute submission, they are my legal property. Silas moved. He did not issue a warning. He simply leveled the heavy barrel of the long rifle directly at the chest of the cruel aristocrat. His low, rumbling voice vibrated with pure, murderous intent, shaking the very dust from the timber rafters. Get out of my chair and get off my mountain. Arthur did not flinch. His cruel smile only widened. He simply raised his manicured hand and snapped his fingers. The unmistakable, Terrifying metallic clicks of 6 heavy revolvers cocking echoed simultaneously through the tense room. Every mercenary stepped forward, drawing their weapons and aiming directly at the giant mountain man. The arrogant brother-in-law leaned forward, his eyes locked entirely upon the trembling, pale face of the beautiful widow standing behind the giant. You have a choice to make. Little bird, you can pack your pathetic canvas sack and walk out that door with me right now. You will return to the eastern city in heavy iron chains, and you will work the heavy factory looms until your delicate bones turn to dust. Or, you can refuse. If you refuse my legal right, my men will shoot this giant brute where he stands. They will burn this miserable timber shack to the frozen earth, and I will drag you down the mountain over his massive, bleeding corpse. The law is entirely on my side. His blood will be entirely upon your hands. Evelyn felt the breath rip violently from her fragile lungs. Utter, suffocating despair crashed over her, burying the triumphant pride of the harvest fair under a heavy mountain of ash. This was her profound, inescapable punishment. She looked at Silas. The giant mountain man stood completely unyielding, his massive shoulders squared, ready to unleash absolute violence to protect her. He would fight them all. He would gladly die upon these floorboards to keep her safe, but Evelyn could not allow it. The true test of her love was not allowing him to sacrifice himself. It was finding the agonizing, impossible courage to sacrifice herself for his survival. The midnight wind howled fiercely through the open door, carrying the scent of impending, absolute ruin. Will Evelyn wait for the heavily armed men to fall asleep and sneak away into the freezing night to protect Silas from the violent wrath of her cruel brother-in-law? The suffocating darkness of the mountain night offered absolutely no true sanctuary. The heavily armed mercenaries had claimed the thick timber floorboards of the common room, their loud, careless voices and the sharp clinking of stolen whiskey bottles echoing cruelly through the isolated boarding house. Arthur Vance had commandeered the warmest guest room near the hearth, fully expecting his absolute legal authority to remain completely unchallenged by morning. Evelyn stood perfectly still within the freezing shadows of the back pantry. She did not pack the frayed canvas sack. She knew the cruel brother of her late husband would immediately search for it. She took only her thin wool shawl and the battered leather journal, pressing the book desperately against her violently shivering chest. She possessed a terrifying, unbreakable resolve. She would not allow the honorable, giant mountain man to bleed upon his own floorboards for her hidden debts. She slowly lifted the heavy iron latch of the rear kitchen door. The freezing mountain wind violently struck her pale face. She stepped out into the brutal, ice-slicked mud, leaving behind the only true home she had ever known. Her delicate boots broke through the hard, icy crust of the deep snow. Every single step away from the warm boarding house felt like a heavy iron blade dragging across her fragile heart. The brutal winter air whipped her faded pastel dress violently around her slender legs. She intended to walk down the treacherous, frozen pass, to locate the distant valley settlement, and to surrender herself completely to the local magistrate before dawn broke. If she turned herself over to the harsh Eastern laws, Arthur would possess no legal justification to burn the sanctuary upon the mountain. She thought of the heavy iron skillets, the sweet aroma of the slow-roasted molasses, and the profound, quiet peace she had discovered while kneading flour upon the pale timber table. She was choosing to cast herself into the freezing void to ensure those beautiful things remained whole. She wept silently, her hot tears freezing instantly upon her pale cheeks. She traded her absolute freedom to ensure Silas would continue to breathe. She marched for an hour through the howling blackness. The intense cold began to violently numb her fragile fingers. Her strength was failing rapidly. She stumbled against a hidden, frozen pine root, falling heavily to her knees in the deep, unforgiving snowdrift. She gasped for air, hugging the precious leather journal tightly, preparing to force her exhausted, bruised body upward one final time. A massive, impenetrable darkness suddenly blocked the howling wind. Evelyn gasped loudly, lifting her trembling, tear-stained face. Silas stood directly before her on the frozen trail. He wore no heavy winter coat against the brutal storm. He wore only his coarse fabric shirt, his massive chest heaving violently with raw, unchecked adrenaline. He had not slept. He had understood the devastating, self-sacrificing nature of her fragile heart. When the boarding house grew quiet, he had immediately checked her small room. Finding it entirely empty, a cold terror far worse than any wartime artillery fire had seized his massive chest. He had tracked her through the blinding storm with the terrifying speed of a desperate predator. The heavy, iron-repeating rifle fell from his massive hand. It plunged silently into the deep snow, entirely forgotten. For the first time since the devastating war 20 years ago, the giant mountain man completely lost his ancient, stoic composure. The impenetrable walls of heavy ice, protecting his scarred soul, violently shattered into fine dust. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He dropped heavily to his knees in the freezing snow directly before her. He did not offer a gentle, cautious touch. He reached out with his massive, calloused hands and desperately pulled her slender, shivering frame directly against his broad, solid chest. He buried his weathered, scarred face deep into her freezing, wind-blown hair. His massive shoulders shook with a profound, terrifying fear of loss. He crushed her against him as if attempting to shield her from the violent universe itself. His deep, rumbling voice broke entirely. It vibrated with a raw, bleeding desperation that echoed clearly over the howling wind. You will not walk away from me. You will not surrender your light to the dark. Evelyn collapsed against his massive strength, her cold hands gripping the coarse fabric of his shirt. Her voice was a fragile, shattered whisper. I must leave. He will kill you. He will burn your beautiful sanctuary to ash. I cannot allow my ruined past to destroy the only good man I have ever known. Silas pulled back slightly, framing her delicate, freezing face between his massive, rough palms. His sharp, dark eyes burned with absolute, undeniable defiance. He did not look at her as a fragile, broken widow. He looked at her as his exact equal, the absolute center of his resurrected world. Let him burn the dead wood. He brushed his thick thumb across her pale, tear-stained cheek, wiping away the freezing moisture. You do not understand what you have done. I was a hollow ghost haunting a graveyard of timber. Did not care if the bitter winter finally claimed me. But you brought the fire back. You fed the weary travelers. You healed my broken hands. You possess more courage in your delicate spirit than any soldier I ever led into battle. The boarding house is merely stone and pine. You are the true hearth. You are my complete heart. I will not trade your absolute freedom for a heavy roof. Evelyn stopped breathing. The absolute, emotional resolution of his words struck her with the beautiful force of a falling star. The romantic confession was stark, stripped of all polite societal artifice, and incredibly profound. He did not simply desire her, he fundamentally required her spirit to survive. The suffocating shame and the crushing terror she had carried for months evaporated entirely into the cold mountain air. She looked up at his hardened, beautiful face. She reached up, her delicate fingers gently tracing the heavy, faded scar along his strong jawline. She fully accepted his absolute devotion. She fully accepted his dangerous protection. I will stay. We will face them together. Silas closed his eyes, a deep, shuddering breath escaping his massive lungs. The agonizing terror of losing her finally receded. He opened his eyes, the fierce, protective fire returning to his sharp gaze with a terrifying intensity. He stood up slowly, bringing her up with him. He wrapped his massive arms securely around her delicate waist, anchoring her entirely against his side. He reached down and retrieved the heavy iron repeating rifle from the deep snowdrift. They turned around, facing the steep, treacherous climb back towards the isolated boarding house. The cruel aristocrat and his heavily armed mercenaries were waiting for the dawn, fully expecting the terrified widow to surrender her dignity to their violent threats. They did not realize they had awakened a dormant, unstoppable force upon the high pass. How far will the cruel brother-in-law go now that his absolute, arrogant authority has been completely defied by the giant mountain man? The heavy boots of Silas and the delicate steps of Evelyn moved with absolute purpose up the steep, frozen trail. They possessed a profound, unbreakable unity now, forged in the freezing dark and sealed by a desperate romantic confession. Yet, as they cleared the final line of snow-heavy pines, a terrifying, unnatural light violently pierced the darkness. The windows of the boarding house did not glow with the gentle, welcoming yellow of a hearth fire. They burned with a fierce, violent orange, vomiting thick black smoke into the pristine mountain air. Arthur Vance did not wait for the morning. The cruel aristocrat had discovered the empty guest room and realized his absolute authority meant nothing upon this wild mountain. Driven by arrogant fury and profound cowardice, he had chosen to destroy the very heart of their defiance. He had chosen to burn the kitchen. Silas dropped the heavy iron, repeating rifle into the snow. A weapon of war possessed no power against a roaring inferno. He lunged forward, his massive frame covering the distance to the porch with terrifying speed. Evelyn followed closely behind, her fragile lungs burning with the freezing air, her arms still clutching the precious leather journal fiercely against her chest. They burst through the heavy oak door. The common room was entirely empty, the armed mercenaries having fled the terrifying blaze they had created. The kitchen was a scene of absolute, deliberate desecration. The heavy sacks of coarse buckwheat and precious flour had been violently slashed open. The fine, white powder coated the air, and the floorboards like a terrible, suffocating snow. In the center of the room, Arthur stood near the pale timber table, holding a shattered glass lantern dripping with highly flammable oil. He saw them enter. A cruel, vindictive sneer twisted his aristocratic features. He tossed a burning match directly into the thick cloud of airborne flour. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely devastating. The fine flour dust ignited in a massive, violent flash of blinding heat. The sudden explosion of fire blew Arthur backward through the rear pantry door, sending him tumbling out into the freezing mud. The flames immediately latched onto the oil-soaked floorboards and the heavy timber walls, climbing rapidly toward the dry wooden ceiling. Silas ignored the fleeing cowards entirely. He turned his immense, terrifying focus entirely upon the violent flames consuming his home. Evelyn did not freeze in terror. The paralyzing fear that had controlled her existence for months was completely gone, burned away by the profound love of the giant man standing beside her. She knew the kitchen. She knew the location of every water bucket, every heavy wool blanket, and every jar of preserved food. She required both of her delicate hands to fight this absolute destruction. She desperately placed her battered leather journal down upon the edge of the pale timber table, pushing it away from the immediate flames. She grabbed a heavy iron bucket from the wash basin the freezing water sloshing over the sides. They moved together into the roaring heat. It was a terrifying, violent mirror of the quiet, synchronized cooking routine they had perfected over the past month. They communicated entirely through desperate action. Silas grabbed thick, heavy wool blankets from the common room, soaking them rapidly in the water barrel. He waded directly into the flames, his massive, broad shoulders absorbing the blistering heat. He used his immense physical strength to smother the burning walls, beating the fire down with brutal, relentless force. Evelyn moved rapidly behind his massive shield. She threw heavy arcs of water directly onto the spreading edges of the fire, preventing the flames from reaching the deep pantry where the precious molasses and the salt pork remained hidden. The thick, black smoke burned her delicate eyes and choked her fragile lungs, but she refused to step back. She fought with the fierce, undeniable courage of a woman fiercely protecting her true home. The heavy iron stove, superheated by the surrounding inferno, hissed violently as Evelyn cast water upon the roaring floorboards nearby. The noise was absolutely deafening. Suddenly, a massive, burning support beam above the pale timber table groaned loudly. The heavy iron bolts snapped under the extreme heat. The thick, flaming timber plummeted downward, threatening to crush the center of the kitchen and spread the fire across the entire room. Silas moved with impossible, terrifying speed. He stepped directly beneath the falling beam. He raised his massive, calloused hands and caught the burning timber. The immense weight drove him to his knees, his massive muscles straining violently beneath the coarse fabric of his shirt. The flames licked at his heavy arms. The giant mountain man let out a deafening roar of absolute defiance, refusing to let the heavy wood fall. Throw the water. His deep, commanding voice cut cleanly through the roar of the fire. Evelyn lifted the heaviest iron bucket she could manage. She stepped dangerously close to the massive flames and threw the freezing water directly over the burning beam and the massive arms of the man she loved. Thick, blinding white steam erupted through the kitchen. The violent hiss echoed loudly as the deep fire finally surrendered to the water and the sheer, unyielding will of the two inhabitants. Silas threw the blackened, smoking timber heavily to the wet floorboards. The violent orange glow died away, replaced by the quiet, silver light of the moon, filtering through the shattered windows. The brutal smoke began to slowly clear, drawn out by the freezing mountain wind. They had won. The kitchen was heavily scorched, completely soaked, and filled with deep black soot, but the heavy timber structure remained standing. The heart of the boarding house had survived the cowardly attack. Silas stood up slowly, his massive chest heaving heavily. His coarse shirt was blackened, and his arms bore the angry red marks of the extreme heat. Evelyn walked toward him through the ruined flour and the deep ash. Her faded pastel dress was completely ruined, covered in dark soot and freezing water, but she had never looked more beautiful to his sharp, dark eyes. She reached out, her trembling, delicate hands gently touching his massive, scorched chest. They leaned against one another, finding absolute peace in the quiet aftermath of the violent storm. The profound adrenaline slowly receded, returning their minds to the surrounding reality. Evelyn turned her head, looking through the settling dust toward the pale timber table. The heavy wood was deeply charred, the surface covered entirely in thick, wet ash from the fallen beam. She took a slow, terrified step forward, her heart suddenly seizing in her fragile chest. She reached her delicate hands into the dark soot where she had hastily placed her precious inheritance. Did the irreplaceable recipe journal survive the flames? Evelyn plunged her delicate, trembling hands directly into the thick, wet ash blanketing the charred timber table. Her frantic fingers dug through the heavy black soot and the ruined, soaked flour, desperately searching for the familiar shape of the thick leather cover. The freezing mountain wind howled through the shattered glass of the kitchen windows, biting harshly against her wet, ruined pastel dress. But she felt only the violent, suffocating panic rising in her throat. Her fragile fingertips finally brushed against a solid object hidden beneath the heavy debris of the fallen timber beam. She gripped the object and pulled it slowly into the pale, silver moonlight. A devastating, shattered sob ripped through her exhausted chest. The heavy leather journal was entirely destroyed. The intense, blistering heat of the roaring fire had completely melted the binding, fusing the ancient leather into a rigid, deformed block. The freezing water they had thrown to save the structure had violently soaked the fragile inner pages. As Evelyn lifted the book, the wet, burned paper simply disintegrated. The pages crumbled into useless black sludge, slipping through her pale fingers and falling back onto the ruined floorboards. The beautiful, elegant script of her beloved grandmother, the faded ink that contained the exact measurements of their survival, was washed away into absolute nothingness. Evelyn collapsed to her knees in the wet ash. She buried her face in her soot-stained hands, weeping with a profound, unendurable agony. He winced from the ache. The boarding house had survived the cruel malice of her brother-in-law, but the true heart of her existence was gone. The journal was not merely a collection of instructions for mixing flour and root vegetables. It was the only remaining proof that she had ever belonged to a loving family. It was her sole inheritance, her invisible shield against a deeply cruel world, and the precise instrument she had utilized to build her beautiful connection with the giant mountain man. Without the faded pages, she felt entirely empty, a hollow shell stripped of all value. Silas stepped heavily over the blackened, smoking remains of the fallen support beam. He ignored the painful burns upon his massive forearms. He saw the fragile widow weeping upon the wet floorboards, her delicate frame shaking violently with her absolute loss. He did not attempt to offer hollow, useless reassurances about replacing the lost paper. He understood the profound, sacred weight of a relic from the past. He knelt slowly beside her in the thick ash, his massive presence providing a steady, silent anchor in the center of her overwhelming grief. He reached out toward the charred table. A single, torn fragment of heavy paper had miraculously escaped the direct flames, blown toward the edge of the wood by the violent explosion of the flour. The edges of the paper were heavily scorched, but the center remained entirely intact, illuminated perfectly by the cold moonlight. Silas picked up the fragile scrap with his massive, calloused fingers. He looked down at the faded ink. The breath completely vanished from his massive lungs. His broad, muscular chest froze entirely. The deep, ancient walls of his stoic composure did not merely crack, they evaporated into the freezing air. His sharp, dark eyes widened in absolute, staggering disbelief. He stood up slowly, bringing the scorched paper closer to the silver light. Evelyn lowered her hands, looking up at his towering figure. She saw the profound, violent shock twisting his scarred features. He looked exactly as he had upon the second morning when he had first tasted the terrible, bitter broth of the winter encampments. Silas stared at the handwriting in the margins of the surviving scrap. He did not read the ingredients. He traced the specific, elegant loop of the lettering with his rough thumb. He looked closely at a single line of text that had been deliberately crossed out with thick, black ink 20 years ago. His deep, rumbling voice broke the silence. It was not a roar of anger. It was a hushed, trembling whisper of absolute, profound awe. I know this hand. I know the exact, deliberate curve of this ink. Evelyn stood up slowly, her fragile body swaying slightly in the cold wind. She wiped the dark soot from her pale cheeks. That is the writing of my grandmother. It is the only thing she left to me before she passed. Silas looked down at her fragile, beautiful face. The entire universe seemed to suddenly shift upon its massive axis. The devastating cruelty of the world, the bitter isolation of his mountain, and the terrible tragedy of her ruined marriage suddenly coalesced into a profound, undeniable design. It was a cruel joke turned directly into absolute, unbreakable destiny. He took a slow, heavy step toward her, his dark eyes shining with overwhelming emotion. When the brutal artillery fire finally ceased, I was bleeding into the frozen Virginia mud. My men were gone. My massive body was utterly broken, and I actively prayed for the dark to finally claim me. But a woman found me. She was a volunteer in the field hospital, a tiny, fierce creature who refused to let massive men die in the dirt. She dragged me toward the medical tents. Silas lifted the scorched scrap of paper, his massive hand trembling violently. She carried a heavy leather journal exactly like yours. I watched her cross out a line of text with a thick quill while I lay upon the canvas cot. She held a tin cup of dark, bitter broth to my mouth. I refused to drink. I wished to perish. She ordered me to open my mouth, claiming she did not drag a giant from the mud merely to watch him surrender. She kept my heart beating. She gave me the strength to walk back to this mountain. Evelyn stared at the giant man. Her delicate mouth parted in absolute, stunned silence. The mysterious veteran at the harvest fair had recognized the unique spices, but the truth was far deeper. The terrifying, stoic veteran who had shielded her from the brutal storm was the exact same broken soldier her beloved grandmother had saved from the ash of war. Silas reached out, gently wrapping his massive, warm hand over her delicate, soot-stained fingers. You did not bring a curse to my door. You brought the exact same light that saved my life 20 years ago. We were always meant to find this hearth together. The profound awe of the revelation settled over them like a warm, heavy blanket, completely erasing the bitter cold of the ruined kitchen. They were bound by blood, by survival, and by an unbreakable spiritual connection forged decades before they ever met. Yet, as Evelyn looked down at the empty, wet ash covering the pale timber table, a quiet, lingering uncertainty remained. The physical journal was gone forever, consumed completely by the violent flames. Without the physical book, will they be able to recreate the precise, beautiful recipes that bind them together? Dawn broke over the high pass. The brutal winter storm had finally passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, piercing blue. The ruined kitchen stood exposed to the freezing morning air, the shattered windows framing the deep, blackened destruction. Yet, Evelyn and Silas did not stand in the wet ash with despair. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands tightly intertwined, anchored completely by the profound revelation of the night before. They possessed absolutely nothing but each other, and as the cold wind whipped around them, they realized it was more than enough to conquer the cruel world. A low, steady rumble vibrated through the frozen earth. It was not the biting wind. Silas turned his massive head toward the steep mountain trail, his broad shoulders tensing defensively, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. Dozens of heavy timber wagons crested the icy ridge. They were not driven by the cruel, heavily armed men of Arthur Vance. They were driven by the rough, soot-stained loggers, the weary miners, and the hardened rivermen who had tasted the profound warmth of her slow-roasted molasses beans at the harvest fair. Alongside them walked the humble, hard-working women of the lower valley settlements, carrying thick woven blankets, fresh sacks of heavy grain, and large wooden buckets of sweet cream. Leading the massive, silent procession was the elderly veteran, leaning heavily upon his polished wooden cane. They had seen the unnatural orange glow against the night sky from the lower camps. They had marched through the freezing dark to protect the beating heart of their mountain. Arthur Vance emerged from the deep snow near the tree line, his pristine velvet overcoat ruined by the mountain mud, his aristocratic face pale with absolute cowardice as he witnessed the massive, angry crowd of hardened frontier workers gathering before the porch. The elderly veteran did not raise a weapon. He simply walked toward the cruel aristocrat and threw a heavy, bulging leather sack directly into the freezing mud at his feet. The thick canvas burst open, spilling hundreds of shining silver coins into the snow. It was a collection raised entirely by the Grateful Valley, a massive sum contributed by every single person who had found solace in the delicate hands of the widow. It was the absolute sum required to sever the dark, crushing ledger forever. The veteran spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority. Take your silver, and do not ever cast your shadow upon our mountain again. Arthur Vance looked at the absolute, unified wall of humanity standing behind the giant mountain man and the fragile widow. He knew he possessed no power here against their fierce, undeniable loyalty. He gathered the heavy silver in humiliating silence and fled down the treacherous pass like a broken, cowardly ghost, vanishing from their lives completely. The mountain's community did not simply pay the impossible debt. They remained upon the high pass to heal the physical wound. Over the next week, the crisp alpine air filled with the rhythmic strike of heavy axes, the sharp ring of iron hammers, and the cheerful shouts of men working with profound purpose. They replaced the charred support beams, installed fresh, thick glass into the window frames, and scrubbed the thick black soot from the heavy timber walls. They rebuilt the stone hearth stronger and deeper than it was before, ensuring the fierce mountain wind could never extinguish the flames. Evelyn stood in the center of her magnificent new kitchen. A beautiful, pristine timber table, carved directly from the heart of a massive alpine oak, rested before the roaring iron stove. Silas stood directly behind her, his massive hands resting gently upon her delicate shoulders, providing a deep, eternal warmth that anchored her completely to the present moment. She looked down at the empty wooden surface. She closed her eyes, drawing a slow, deep breath of the pine-scented air. She did not need the battered leather journal. The vital instructions were not lost into the ash. They were permanently etched into the very fiber of her soul. She reached for the coarse buckwheat flour, the heavy sorghum molasses, and the wild mountain honey. Her delicate hands moved with a perfect, beautiful grace, guided entirely by the memory of the grandmother who had saved the giant mountain man, and fueled by the profound love she now held for him. As she sprinkled the final, secret ingredient into the bubbling iron pot, the quiet, absolute devotion of time, profound patience, and selfless care, the kitchen filled with a magnificent, intoxicating aroma that surpassed any meal she had ever cooked before. The broken past was finally laid to rest, replaced entirely by a brilliant, beautiful future built upon undeniable trust. The brutal winter eventually surrendered to the gentle, thawing warmth of the mountain spring. The heavy snow melted away from the high pass, revealing brilliant patches of wild, green alpine grass and bright yellow blossoms dancing in the warm breeze. The isolated boarding house was no longer a silent, brooding monument to grief and forgotten wars. It was a thriving, magnificent beacon of life, completely overflowing with the joyous laughter of weary travelers and the deep, abiding peace of the two beautiful souls who guarded its roaring hearth. Silas and Evelyn found their absolute salvation within the quiet, rhythmic moments of their shared existence. They discovered that the deepest wounds inflicted by a cruel world could indeed be washed away, not by grand gestures of wealth or empty societal promises, but by the steady, daily labor of profound devotion. True strength did not reside solely in the ability to swing a heavy axe or carry an unbearable physical burden alone. True strength resided in the terrifying, beautiful courage required to open a shattered heart and allow another person to step safely inside. The forgotten wartime recipes had ultimately served their highest, most sacred purpose. They had bridged the immense, silent gap between a stoic, giant protector who believed he was utterly unworthy of human warmth, and a delicate, suffering widow who believed she was a permanent curse upon the earth. They had fed the starving, sheltered the lost, and forged an unbreakable family out of absolute, smoking ruin. Their legacy was no longer bound in fragile leather or written in fading ink. It was alive, breathing, and completely indestructible. As the golden sunlight faded over the jagged western peaks, casting long, peaceful shadows across the heavy wooden porch, Silas pulled Evelyn close against his massive chest. She rested her delicate head over his steady, beating heart, completely safe, entirely cherished, and profoundly home. The fire within their hearts would never go out again. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is designed for a PG, family-friendly audience, focusing entirely on wholesome romance, emotional healing, and personal growth without graphic violence or mature content.